If I have already had COVID, here's another one. I don't need to take the vaccine. I'm immune. Is that true?
So no. We don't really know how long immunity lasts, either from COVID exposure, from actually having the disease, or from this vaccine. And that's also a function of how new this germ is to the world. We just don't, there's so much we don't know about it. So, I mean, we may find out in a couple of years that once you've been infected with COVID, you have an extremely, extremely tiny chance of actually, having symptoms from being infected again. And but we don't, first of all, don't know that yet. And what we do know is that when people are vaccinated for other infectious diseases, it doesn't keep them from getting infected with those diseases again. It usually just prevents them from getting sick and from spreading it. So we don't know what, being infected with COVID itself, what we would call primary infection with COVID. We don't really know what that means for either, your ability to get reinfected or your ability to spread the pathogen if you do get infected again. So both of those things are major goals of getting a vaccine, and what we're hoping will be a good result of taking the vaccine. So we know at least the vaccine prevents people from becoming infected, becoming sick from infection again. We don't yet know what the effect of the vaccine will be on people's ability to infect each other. So still, and I should add, we do have a few reports of cases where people who had the COVID infection earlier became reinfected and became sick. So we know that that can happen after, just an organic infection with COVID. So all this to say, even if you've already had COVID, probably a good idea to get vaccinated once you are able to.
It could end up being like the flu, right? I mean, we get flu shots every year. We don't get a flu shot once and don't get it the next year because you can still get the flu, right? It's good for when it's good for that year.
Right. Although the reason is a little different. The flu is a very special virus in the fact that it is very promiscuous. And so it changes the way it looks every year in certain parts of it. I just heard a conversation with a scientist talking about whether we might, because this vaccine was made so quickly and is so effective. I mean, this is a way more effective vaccine than the flu vaccine, you realize. Like the flu vaccine on a good year is like 50% effective. It's, which is, I mean, it's a great improvement, and it really, really helps to protect particularly the most medically fragile people in our communities. But the coronavirus vaccines that we've seen, the data from them are very strong. So people have been talking about, well, is this something that maybe this technology, something we should be using for the flu vaccine? Because it might make the flu vaccine a little bit better. There are some barriers to that we could talk about if you want, but this is a pretty effective vaccine. So it's exciting.
So we touched on this before, the African American community.
Yeah.
Last time we were here, you and I talked, and obviously there are legitimate historical apprehensions on the part of the African American community. We all know that, but what people may not know. So I've been looking at this other physician who's been tweeting, Eugene Gu or Gu.
Yeah.
And he's been talking about the disproportionate number of whites versus African Americans in Moderna and Pfizer's clinical trials. So let me do this first. If your clinical trials only focus on one segment of the population or primarily one race in the population, is that a good situation for African Americans? In other words, if he's saying that mostly whites win clinical trials, almost no African Americans, should that make African Americans more apprehensive? Or in fact, not just that, Does that say anything about the effectiveness of the vaccine on African Americans or the people of color at all?
Great question, Mark. And I think this is a really, really complicated question. So let's break it down a little bit.
Please.
So what happens in a vaccine trial? What happens is that a company opens up a bunch of clinics in a bunch of cities and makes announcements that they are recruiting people to participate in the trial. And if you make a phone call, if you tear off the number from one of those sheets or you see it on the internet and you make a phone call, somebody will usually explain to you what's involved in the trial. And they usually tell you have to make, 5 visits in total. The first visit is an hour of intake. The second visit is labs. The third visit, you actually get the vaccine. The fourth visit is an interim safety visit. The fifth visit is the second vaccine, and the sixth. And it's usually a bunch of visits, okay? And a fair amount of time. And resources, right? Because you usually have to get from wherever you are to wherever the clinic is. And of course, they want to maximize the cross-section. They want to make their population that they enroll in their trials the best cross-section of humanity that they can. But in reality, you need resources to participate in a clinical trial. And if you're in a city, which like most American cities, where resources are apportioned in higher amounts to, by race, you're going to have certain racial disparities in the people that enroll in clinical trials. This is not a new phenomenon to this vaccine. Historically, there's broad underrepresentation of Black folks in clinical trials throughout the United States for all kinds of medicines and all kinds of vaccines and biologics. For a lot of these reasons, it just doesn't, if somebody's working, if it lives in a part of town where they have, an exploitative landlord and have to work badly paying jobs and have to use public transportation to get around, it's not as easy and fast as using a car in the city. If it's inconvenient and doesn't pay, and there's no incentive for a person of color to participate in one of these trials. So there's a lot of underrepresentation. And at the same time, there's overrepresentation of Black folks and other people of color in the sector that is considered essential workers right now, right? Okay. And so they're the ones who have to be out and about, have to be around other people, and would therefore likely benefit the most from this vaccine. So this is a really not great situation, right? The people who would benefit the most from the vaccine are the least represented in the trials of the vaccine. So there are a lot of places where I think anybody listening could say, oh, here's things need to be changed to both raise the representation of Black folks and other folks of color in vaccine trials and reduce their representation among the folks that, are essential workers, or at least make give some equity to representation and all of that. All that said, I think the differences the other thing that makes this complicated is, I in medical school learned that there were biologic differences in the way certain diseases impact Black people compared to white people. I learned that certain drugs work better in white people than in Black people, or in Black people than in white people, for hypertension, for diabetes. Right. What we learned since I was in medical school is that a lot of those differences are actually not a consequence of biology, but are a consequence of social disparities, like being poor, not having access to good food, not having access to transportation, not understanding the things that your doctor is telling you, not trusting the things that your doctor is telling you. So there are a lot of differences in medicine between races that are actually not an issue of biology. However, there are some differences that are biologic in the way people of different colors and different ethnicities process drugs. Now, these are, we're talking about how people's liver enzymes process different kinds of medicines, different kinds of chemical compounds. And this is something that you can even look at genetically. It affects how people are affected by painkillers, how people are affected by tuberculosis drugs, all kinds of drugs. I don't think this vaccine would be in the category where you could really expect to see a big biologic difference between races. But I do think that you could expect that people who are Black folks, for example, would just simply live higher risk lives by necessity of their jobs or their home situations than a white person would. And so we may see that, you know, if somebody, if a white person is enrolled in a trial, I'm white, so I'm pointing at myself, but and I, you know, and a Black person is enrolled in a trial, in the 2 weeks in between visits, you know, to the trial clinic, I might get out of the house 2 times because I'm able to work from home. Meanwhile, if this person works, you know, in a kitchen, they leave the house 14 times.
Okay, right.
So they just have more exposure, a higher risk, and their outcome might be different, even if the vaccine is very good. So yeah, I mean, I guess I think we may see different effectiveness levels once we disseminate the vaccine into populations of color. I don't necessarily think that those will be for a biological reason. I think they'll probably be more for social reasons if we see those differences. And I do think that for those and other reasons, it's just really important for us to try and have Black folks and other people of color in clinical trials, not just of vaccines, but of all medicines.
Yeah. But obviously there is this apprehension in the Black community.
A very rational one. I mean, it's really rational. If you have heard anything about Tuskegee, there are all these studies about, you know, the closer you are actually to where Tuskegee took place, and the more you know about it, the more likely you are to distrust doctors. So this is a rational response.